Welcome. There's a lot of different ways you can glaze your pottery, or not. I mean, for some pottery, we don't use glazes, like when I do pit fire. There's no glazes on that. It's just natural colors from the fire. But I guess most people want to apply some sort of glaze to their pottery. And there's essentially two ways you can go about that. You can buy commercial glazes, which is fine. I do that too sometimes. Or you can mix your own glazes. As some of you know, I do enjoy mixing my own glazes. So in this video, I'll be focusing on why I think you should go ahead with that and mix your own glazes, what the benefits are of doing that. I will take you through everything from how you find the right recipes, how you find the materials, and how you find them the cheapest ways, how you manage all these materials and how you keep track of your glazes, and not at least how you actually mix your glazes. So let's get on with that. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of good reasons to mix your own glazes versus buying them. One of them is that there's so many more glazes available if you mix them yourself. I mean, even the big producers of glazes, Ameco, Terracolor, and so on, they do have lots of glazes. I mean, some of them even hundreds of glazes. But if you look at the open market for glaze recipes that have been done over centuries or millenniums, there's thousands of different glazes. And not only that, but you can take a glaze recipe and very easily make adjustments to it. I'm no chemist, so I don't know how to make a glaze from nothing. I work based on recipes, but it's relatively easy to learn how to do minor adjustments, make them a little more matte, maybe making them a little more glossy, change the colorants, take a white glaze and make it colorful. You know, make these minor changes, make it run a little more, make it run a little less. These kind of adjustments are actually not so difficult. Of course, you need to read up a little bit about how the different components of a glaze works. So that's one of the reasons. Another good reason is that it's so much cheaper. Let's look at these two pots. One of them is made with Ameco, Potter's Choice glaze, and the other one is made with a early variation of floating blue. I think they both turned out very well. Can you guess which one is which? I'll get back to that. Anyway, the important thing here is that the Ameco glaze cost about $26 per liter, depending on where you buy it. But that's a price based on Sive in Europe. The other one, the floating blue that I mix myself, cost me about $2.50 roughly per liter of finished glaze. So that's 10 times more per liter for the Ameco glaze. I'm not saying Ameco is too expensive, they need to have a markup as well, but it's just, worth noting that it's actually 10 times, up to 10 times more expensive to buy glaze. It can be even more expensive if you buy it in a more expensive shop. So let's get back to which is which. I actually like the one to the right the most. And that's the cheapest one. That's the floating blue that I mixed. The one to the left looks good too. It's Ameco. But given the fact that I actually like the one I mixed myself more than the one I paid 10 times more for, I don't see much reason to do that. So yes, I mix most of my glazes myself. I don't invent my own glazes. I think you need to be more or less a chemist, or at least very geeky with glazes to do that. I base my glazes I mix on recipes others have developed over years, over centuries. And there's so many good glazes available. I have two main sources, or three main sources for glaze recipes. One of them is good friends, other potters that have come around to good recipes, and if I like what they do, we talk about it, and sometimes they're happy to share their recipes. Another good source is glazy.org. Glaze.org is a website dedicated to glazing recipes and chemistry about it. And they have a lot of tools where you can recalculate the chemistry of your glazes, and it's very advanced and very, very good. But you can also just go in and look for recipes, and if you look, you can sort it by different temperatures, and you can sort it by different colors, different styles of glazing, and you can sort it by the rating. Users can rate the glazes, and I mean, there are thousands of glazes in there. That's a good starting point. Very often there are pictures and some comments about how they used it, how they replaced some of the materials, and so on and so on. It's a very, very good resource for glazes. The third, and what I actually use the most these days, is books. Very good books and thorough books about how to make glaze. And one of them that I will highly recommend is the books by John Britt. John Britt is a potter and is well known for his extensive knowledge about glazing. He's a glaze nerd. I don't think I offend him by saying that. He knows a lot about glazing, a lot more than I will probably ever know and need to know. He wrote a few really, really good books about glazes. One of them is for mid-fire glazes, so cone 6 glazes, so around 1200, 1220 C Celsius, that have 400 different glazes. He also have a high fire book that also have equally good, equally lots of glazes. That book in itself is basically all you need. There are glazes of all kinds of firing, for all kinds of pottery, all colors, all styles. I mean, whoever needs that many glazes? I don't mix that many glazes. I have a few glazes that I really like. There are basically 3 important elements that influence how it looks. You have the clay, you have the glaze, and you have the fire. So different kinds of clay will produce very different results with different kinds of, or the same glaze. I actually made a video about this, I can put a link here somewhere, where I took the same couple of glazes and applied them to different clay bodies, and I combined them in different ways, and you can see how different that actually turns out. So the clay, if you have a white clay, it will look one way. If you have a clay with a lot of iron in it, that may or may not react with the glaze and make it completely different. So the clay is a very important component. So either you work with just one clay type all the time, and then in that case, you need to find glazes that work well with that. If you work with multiple clays, then don't expect just because the glaze looks great on this clay that it will on other clays. Also, if you look at John Britt's book, or if you look at Glaze.org, be careful and look for the kind of clay that you're using. Maybe they don't have examples of that, and then you need to do your own testing. Don't assume that whatever pictures you see of a glaze will be the same for your clay. So clay is a very important part of it. The clay recipe is, of course, also a very important part of it. And here's an interesting, annoying details. Even if you follow a recipe to the letter, it may not turn out as expected. And the reason for that is that there is inconsistencies in materials. If you take a very common material like Glæaze, it is mined. And the mine is actually closed, but there's tons of it available in the market still, and will be for many years. But depending on how old it is, how deep into the mine that it was mined, it can be very different. So if you have an old bag of Glæaze and a new bag of Glæaze, it may not be the same. And that applies to most of these mined materials, depending on where in the mine it's mined and what mine. Some materials are mined all over the world, and they may be different. Also, there may be different mesh size of it, maybe grounded more or less. And so there can actually be a huge difference. And that is a constant source of frustration for anyone making their own glazes. So I suggest when you buy materials that you actually buy, which is also cheaper, that you buy a big bag of it. Buy 10, 20 kilos of whatever you want to use, because then if you make a glaze and you like it, you can replicate it with the same bag of material. So that's one of the issues you need to deal with. The third part of it is the fire. There are different ways you can fire. You can fire in a ragu kiln, you can fire electric kiln, you can fire in a gas kiln, you can fire in a wood-fired kiln, you can fire in oxidation, neutral atmosphere, or in reduction. There's so many different ways you can fire. And you can fire to different temperatures, of course. This is often measured in cones. So when you see temperatures measured as cones in Glaze.org, for example, it is reference to the time heat factor. Because heat is not the only factor, it's also time. If you let a glaze stay at the same temperature for a longer time, the time heat factor is going to be higher, and that is measured with cones. Physically speaking, cones is these little tiles that are made in the special materials, and when they heat up, they will slowly bend, and that will tell you not only the temperature but the temperature time factor. And that is important because even if you fire to a specific temperature, if you then have a long hole, the heat time is actually going to be higher and the cone is going to be higher. So you've got to be aware of that. The fire in itself, the different ways of firing, the different temperatures, the different schedule, how fast you go up and how you slow down and stuff, is very, very complex. And there's almost an endless ways that you can do that. I decided for several reasons for my glaze work to fix on one cone, one way of firing. I have an electric kiln that I do most of my glaze firing, and I decided I will only do cone 6 glazes. That way I took out one important variable. So now I have fixed my way of firing. I glaze fire always on cone 6, and I have a specific schedule that I always follow. That way I took out that variable. And now I only have to deal with the chemistry of the glaze and the clay body. And that is plenty. There are a couple of reasons why I chose cone 6. There are plenty of really, really nice glazes on cone 6. Some potters will claim, well, you can only do good glazes if you go up to cone 10. In my mind, that's not true. There's plenty of really nice cone 6 glazes. But these days, with the energy prices, there's a cost factor to doing cone 6 because it's a lot cheaper. I saw some calculations on how much energy you use from 0 to 1,000 degrees, from 1,000 to 1,200, from 1,200 to 1,300. And of course, logically enough, it costs a lot more for the last steps. So firing to cone 6 is a lot cheaper than firing to cone 10. So there's a cost issue as well. And it also goes a little bit faster, but that's not so much the issue. But for me also, I don't have, even if I wanted to do different fire schedules and different cones, I simply don't have the storage capacity to have one set of pots ready for this fire, another set of pots for this fire, third set of pots for this. I would have to have so much storage capacity, and I just don't have that. So that's another reason to fix on a specific way of fire. I do, of course, limit myself. There are glazes that could maybe be really, really good if I just adopted changed the fire schedule, but I chose not to. So instead, I try and find glazes that works well with this schedule, which is not that difficult. If you look at, if you go for cone 6 like me and you buy the Mid-Fire book by John Britt, there's 400 glazes there that works great for this schedule. So that should be plenty for anybody. Then I only have to deal with the chemistry, the glaze chemistry, and the clay bodies. I use different kind of clays, and over time I tried an experiment with them on these different bodies. So some clays turn out really nice on one body and not on another one, or they turn out very different. But that's how I go about that. To start making your own glazes, you need materials, and of course, initially, it can be more expensive to make like your first glaze than it is to just buy a bucket of Amaco glazes, because you need to buy these materials. And my recommendation is that you buy, as I mentioned before, bigger bags of materials. because then you can replicate the glaze and not be depending on what batch this material comes from. And you need, some materials to do your glazes. My recommendation is that you start out with glazes that don't have too many different materials. Many of them only have like 4 or 5 different materials. Buy that, and then look for other glazes that produce different results, but basically with the same materials. So if you go for glazes that are based on Glæaze, buy a big bag of Glæaze, and then look for other glazes that have the same kind of materials. You can look that up in glaze.org. Of course, over time, you want to have different colorants, different oxides, different components that can change the basic nature of the glaze. And of course, like me, over time, you build more and more different materials. I think I have 30, 40 different materials in stock now, but I didn't buy it all at one time. I bought it like step by step for the glazes that I need. So then where do you get all these materials? I have researched the market local to me, so that's the European market. There's some suppliers in Denmark that have some materials, but there are also suppliers in other parts of Europe, and most often it's in UK, Ireland, Germany that I get my materials. And what I found is that they all have different selections. Some of them, for example, don't have the American ferrofrites. Some do. Some only have one kind of stain. Some also have mason stains. Some have generic stains. And they may also work, all of them. But what I also find is that the pricing is very, very different. So I don't know, only a few of you from Denmark, but in Denmark, I mostly buy from a small company called Silica Nordic. They're very kind and they have a decent selection of materials and actually quite often very competitive in prices. The biggest player in the Danish market is Sive. They have usually a little bit more variation of materials, but very often also a little more expensive. But most often I buy the bigger chunks of my materials from 3 different suppliers. Skarve, that is in Ireland, Northern Ireland. And now with Brexit and all that, you may think, oh shit, then you have to pay import taxes and all that shit because they're not part of EU, if you, like me, in EU. But no, because there is actually a special deal made during Brexit that excludes Northern Ireland. So they can still ship without you being punished with import taxes. And if you, like me, have a VAT company, you can contact them and they can make a VAT-free invoice for you. I think they do that for most VAT companies. Anyway, that's the deal I have. And they're very friendly and they have a pretty good selection and their pricing is most often very competitive. But there's also a couple of companies in Germany that I use. BSZ and Karl Jäger. Karl Jäger only sell to other companies due to stupid new VAT rules in Europe. It's very difficult to sell to consumers and stuff. And they decided, I understand, only to sell to companies. So you need a VAT number to buy from Karl Jäger. If you don't own your own company, maybe one of your friends that have a company can buy it for you. Karl Jäger also have a good selection and they're usually very competitive in pricing. They don't have everything, none of them have, but take a look and see, maybe some of it is cheap there. BSZ in Essen, in Germany, probably have the biggest selection and the best prices. However, their website, well, to put it bluntly, sucks. They don't have a web shop. They only have PDF files in German with all their products. And they have a huge range of products. And their pricing is extremely low. They are very, very cheap. And the quality, it's the same materials. They have American ferrofrites and they have stains and they have all kinds of materials and they are great quality. And the people working there are very, very nice. They're very, very nice, but also very, very slow. So basically, when you want to order there, you have to take from the PDF and write it into an order form, send it to them, and then, within a few days, they reply with an invoice, and then you have to transfer that in your bank. And then once they get the money, it can also take another week or two, they will ship it to you. So ordering from BSZ can take anywhere from a few weeks to, a month or even more. It's slow, but they're very, very kind, they have a lot of materials, and they're cheap. So I use mostly these 3 plus my local suppliers. For all my materials, I have mapped down where I can buy them the cheapest, because I mean, there's up to 100% difference. So something that costs $50 in one shop can cost $100 in another shop. So don't assume just because you're using Scarva that they are always the cheapest, or BSZ always the cheapest. It's not the case. Generally, for me, I first see if my local supplier have it, because they're so close I can drive there, so don't need to pay for shipping. If they have it and the price is reasonable, I buy it there. I also want to support them. So I try to support silicon ceramics as much as I can. But sometimes they're like 2 or 3 times more expensive. To be honest, I'm not that supportive. So then I turn to some of the other suppliers to see which one is cheapest. And of course, I try to buy multiple things at once, because once I have to ship it, it's much cheaper to like buy a box of different materials and just buy it one by one. I keep track of all my glazes in a now rather huge spreadsheet. And there's 2 parts of it. In one tab, I have all the materials that I use. And I have a name for the material, and I have the amounts that I usually buy, and I have a list or a reference to the shop, a URL to the shop where I buy it, and the price and for the amount that I usually buy. So that's one part of it. That's a way to keep track of the materials that I either expect to buy or have in stock. The other part of the spreadsheet is individual tabs with the recipes. One thing you should know about recipes, and that goes for all the books and glaze.org and everything else, is that there are 2 groups of components, the way that we write recipes. One is the basic components of the recipe, and that should equal 100%. So you add it in, you list it in percentages, and that of course should be 100%. On top of that, you have colorants. So that's going to be in addition to the 100%. I know it's a stupid or silly way of doing it, but that's how everybody does it. So get used to it. In the spreadsheet, I automatically calculate how much the percentage equal to in grams. That makes it much easier to get it right. In the beginning, I wasn't using a spreadsheet, and very often the glaze turned out wrong, and it turned out, I made a miscalculation. Spreadsheets don't make miscalculations. So this way, you can just add in the top, how many grams are you going to mix of this dry material for your glaze, and then it automatically calculates how many grams for each material it is. And you can just tick it off once you start mixing. That's a much more secure way of keeping track of your glaze. Also, I added a lookup into the recipe or the material tab that I was just showing you, so I can see what the cost is for each of the materials and the total cost of that batch. So that way I can see how much it costs. And that's also how, in the beginning I was talking about how my floating glue was 10 times cheaper than the Amico equivalent to that. And that is because I do this calculation in my spreadsheet. All these numbers in the spreadsheet is in Danish kroner, for obvious reason. I'm in Denmark, but you can of course make this in whatever currency you're using. I don't have an inventory tracking in this spreadsheet. Of course, if you want that, you could add that, but it's not necessary because I just go and look at the shelves and see when I'm running out. I'm just ordering new materials. This is, in my opinion, has helped me tremendously when working with glazes. I make much less mistakes, and it's much easier for me to keep track on my glazes. So basically, every time I find a new glaze that I want to mix or potentially want to mix, I add a new tab, and I copy in the basic structure, the lookup of another glaze, and then I replace all the materials and the percentages with the recipe that I'm going to follow. And usually at the bottom of the recipe, I put a link to a reference. If it's something that have a listing on glaze.org, or maybe someone put a post up on Facebook, or there's a blog post, or whatever reference, because that typically have some comments about how much water to add, how fluid it should be, how it should be applied, other comments. And that's just nice to keep that reference in your spreadsheet as well. So let's go and mix a glaze. Today we're going to make a glaze that originates from one of my favorite books that I mentioned before, the mid-fire range glaze, the Cone 6 glaze book from John Britt. And it's actually a very good example of how easy you can alter or adjust the glaze, because I'm not going to make it exactly like it is in the book. But let's first take a look at what you need to make your glaze. Of course, you need a bucket to put it in, and I put some water in, not so much, just a little bit of water in there. And the reason I do that is we're going to put different powdered materials into it, and if you put some water in there, it's not going to be so dusty. But there will be some dust when you're measuring it and stuff, and even though a lot of the materials are not directly toxic, you still don't want to breathe them in. So I highly recommend that you put on some protection, because I mean, if you don't work so much with the glazed materials, it's probably not gonna kill you, but nevertheless, it's not good to inhale, and we always want to stay safe. Some of the materials, like the cobalt, copper and stuff, is toxic, so that's even more dangerous to inhale. So wear good protection. Then you're gonna need a scale. I just use this. I actually got it secondhand, very cheap, but any kind of scale that can take enough for whatever materials you're mixing. And I like to use this bucket, and I put it on my scale, reset it, and then I pour in my materials and put it into the mixing bucket. I have a couple of spoons, whatever you want to do is fine, like this, to take my materials out of my boxes, and a spoon to mix it around. And we're not actually going to finish it today. We're just going to put it in there, add some water, and let it sit overnight. I'll explain more about that later. But back to the recipe itself. This recipe is called charcoal black matte. And as the name suggests, it's a matte black glaze. It is not entirely matte. It takes a very slow cooling to make it very matte. And I don't want it to be matte. But then when I was researching this particular glaze, there's a wonderful Facebook group in support of this particular book. There's thousands of members there, and they share a lot of adjustments of the glazes. I highly recommend that you go in there and participate if you are interested in Cone 6 glazes. There were some people in there trying different things, and particularly one of them came up with a beautiful, in my mind, variation of it, where she actually took out all the original colorants. There's a lot of iron oxide and some cobalt oxide, I think, in it. And she took that out and replaced it with a tiny amount of gray stain and added a lot more rutile. And she made some minor adjustments, also a little more of silica to make it a little bit stronger, which will be good for my plate that I did last week. So I think it's beautiful. It's a grayish, bluish glaze. However, I'm gonna make it a little bit of a difference as well, because I don't have that same gray stain. She got it from Glæaze that I talked about in the beginning of this video. I could order there, but I don't need anything else from Glæaze at the moment. So instead, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little bit of black stain. I'm just going to add about 0.5, maybe 0.3%, I'm still considering, and then a little bit of cobalt. Remember, cobalt, especially cobalt oxides and carbonates, are very, very strong colors. So I'm probably just going to add 0.3%. I can always add more if it turns out too little, but it's very hard to remove it, of course. So that's my basic ingredients. On top of this, I'm also going to bring my computer here with my spreadsheet, with my glazes, and now I have already input this particular glaze and the adjustments. So now I settled on just adding 0.5% of the black stain and 0.3% cobalt. Cobalt is a very strong colorant, so I don't want to add any more than that. In the original recipe, John Britt puts in 2% bentonite. He usually does that on most of his recipes. And the reason for this, one of the reasons for this, is that some glazes have a tendency to settle. So in other words, you know when you take out your glaze and you want to mix it to use and it's just rock hard at the bottom. You probably tried that. It's terrible. But adding 2% bentonite usually avoids that. The reason is that if there's not enough natural clay, the other ingredients that are more heavy, they settle to the bottom. But by adding this clay form, bentonite, you almost completely avoid that. And it doesn't do anything else to the glaze or the coloring. So in the adopted recipe that this woman on Facebook that I referenced, that I really like the look of, she removed bentonite, and I didn't find any explanation of why. And I'm kind of nervous about that, so I added it back into my variation of this recipe. So I have, of the additives, I have a 6% rutile. That's what she added. That was not in the original recipe, and that does something great with the titanium in the feldspar and so on. And I then added the 2% bentonite that she didn't have, and then as a colorant, my difference is that I use 0.5% black stain and 0.3% cobalt carbonate. It won't be exactly the same, but I hope it will be good. Also, in the original recipe, it just calls for feldspar. That's actually almost half of the dry ingredients in this recipe. But in the altered recipe, they are using Forshammer feldspar. I don't have that, but I have other feldspars, soda feldspars. I have two. I have a Kona, a 4 or Mindspar, and a Costa feldspar. Now they're not exactly like Forshammer, but they're close enough that I think it will work. And I was looking up some substitute recipes for this, and one of the suggestions was to use 70% Mindspar and 30% Costa feldspar. So I think I'm gonna go with that. So I added that to my spreadsheet. So I automatically, again, I like automatic calculations. 70% of the Mindspar and 30% Costa. So let's get on with that. I keep all my materials in these plastic boxes, some of them bigger, some of them smaller. And with a clear label, I usually take the one from the supplier and tape it on the outside. And then I can store them. And I actually store them not outside, but I have a shed where I also have my kiln, because there's no problem with freezing or anything, as long as it's dry, and it is dry out there. So this is the Mindspar. I'm going to add that first. And now I already calculated, because the recipes say 48%, so I'm gonna mix up 4,000 grams of dry material. I like to mix up, even though it's a glaze I haven't tried before, it could be completely bad, but I will mix up 4 kilos of dry material, and with the added water that should be maybe about 7-8 liters or something. The reason is I like to dip most of my pots, and you need to have enough glaze for that. And also, worst case, I can throw it out. The total cost of this, of the 4 kilos of dry materials, will be roughly about 113 Danish kroner, and that is, what is that? That is $15 or something like that, roughly speaking. So that's only about 14 kroner, or maybe $1.5–2 per liter of finished glaze. So I mean, it's not that big of an investment. So let's start out with the Mindspar. I'm just going to reset the scale so that it is on 0, including my my bucket. And then of course, remember to take on the protection. Oh, no, you can't hear what I'm saying. So I'm aiming for 1,344 grams. And it's a good idea to be pretty accurate with this. So in order to be able to replicate it again, so I think we're getting close. Just a little bit more. $1,344. Just one little piece. Come on. There we go. So now just gently put it into the water. And I mean, try not to throw it too much around. You see, it will create a little bit of dust. But actually not so bad, because it's dumped into the water. So immediately soaked up by that. That's actually very helpful. So that was the Mindspa part of the equation. And now we'll take the Costa feldspar. It's here. And according to my calculations, I need 576 grams of that. So let's take that. So that's it. And we put that into the other part of it. And here you can start using your spoon and just make sure that it's all covered by water. Because as soon as it's covered by water, it won't create any more dust. As soon as I have added an ingredient, I mark it by making it bold. That way I can follow the recipe and make sure that I get everything added and I don't add something twice. I made that mistake in the past, you know, forgetting one part or adding one part 2 times. And then of course the recipe is going to be different. So that's a good way to keep track of it. Now I will add the other ingredients one by one. I'm not sure if you want to watch all that because it's basically the same. I need to add some whitening, some kaolin, zinc oxide, some silica and some talc, and that's the basic part of the recipe. And then I'm going to add some the rutile and the black stain, the bentonite, and the cobalt carbonate. So there's actually a lot of ingredients in this particular recipe. Not all recipes are that complicated, but I just want so much to do this. Anyway, I'll move on with that. Here's my whitening. And again, I put it in a box with a nice label, so it's easy to see. And I need 760 grams of whitening. And my kaolin, EPK, different kinds of kaolin. The EPK, that is, I think, the most used one in most recipes. Most of my oxides I keep in these glass jars from IKEA. Yep. They're very easy to store, and you usually use a lot less of it, so you take less space. So the zinc oxide, we actually need a lot in this recipe. We need 360 grams. That's quite a lot, but I guess it does something good. And always remember, bold out your ingredients. Next one is silica. This is one that I get from my local supplier. It's a very, very common material, so I think you can get that almost anywhere. And we only need 240 grams for that, which is actually a little bit more than the original recipe. I think it will help make it stronger. to avoid cutlery marks. So, there's the quartz. You see, by doing it this way, really organized, having your recipe in the spreadsheet actually is pretty fast. So the last part of the base ingredients is talc. I buy this from a drugstore. You can also get it in bigger portions. I actually ordered 5 kilo from BSF in Germany because I was running out, but I think there's enough here for that recipe. I only need 120 grams. Yeah, that was enough. Talc is another one of those very cheap elements in glazes. So that was all the basic materials. Now we need to mix in the extras, so the colorants and the stabilizer and so on. So we have some rutile that we need to add. So let me find that here. Rutile. There are different kinds of rutiles, light, and this is a darker one. I usually use that. I think it's going to work. So let's try and see if that does. And we actually need a lot of it, 240 grams. Now remember, everything in recipes is by gram, not by volume, except when they specify that it's not. For example, I use a one-step slip for ragu, and it's by volume, but it is usually by weight. And rutile is very heavy. So this is just 1 spoonful, and it's 235, and I only need 240. So it's actually just about 1 spoonful. So yeah, materials does have very different weights. 240. So. And 2% bentonite. Just gonna put this away. And this one is actually from Carl Jäger. So we are truly making an international glaze this time. And we need 80 grams. The last 2 components is the black stain. And again, this is from a local supplier, a deep black. Black is rather expensive, but not as expensive as the cobalt carbonate. Anything with cobalt is just super expensive. Cobalt carbonate, cobalt stains, cobalt oxides. This is 1 kilo, and it's about 1,000 Danish kroner. So what is it? 150 US dollars, something like that. It's crazy, but it lasts a long time. I use it a lot for my floating blue, one of the glazes I love very much. And this would be enough to mix up about 200 liters. I don't know how many pots I can do with that, but it's literally thousands of pots. So then again, you know, by pot, it's not that expensive, but it is something that you should be careful with. Not least because it is sort of toxic. But we only need very little. I guesstimated that we need 0.5% of the black stain and only 0.3% of the cobalt carbonate. So that's 12 gram and 20 gram. This bucket is way too big to measure that. So instead I have this very small, bowl that I would use instead. For very small amounts, that's much easier to do. So 12 grams, it's not that much, considering I'm putting it into 4 kilos of dry materials, but it is a very strong colorant. I know I said that a few times now, but it really is. And now for the black. Usually I would use something like 4 or 5%. They say up to 6% of this, but that will turn things black. I don't want it black. So that's why I only said 0.5%, which I'm hoping for would be sort of a gray. So 0.5 is 20 grams. So, oh, that was too much. It's actually not very much. I'll reset the scale. I think I need to change the battery. I definitely don't want to put too much of that in. So yeah, 20 grams. Exactly. So now we have all the dry materials, including a little bit of water. And now we're going to go upstairs and add some more water. So the question is, how much water should you add? To be honest, I don't know. Usually it's somewhere around 50-50. So 50% dry materials, 50% water. So I'm probably going to add something like 4 liters, but I'm not going to add it all to begin with because it's much easier to add more water than it is to extract. You can if you put too much in, you can just leave the lid on or heat it up a little bit and vaporize the water. But it's much easier just to add a little bit too little. And then when we start measuring it, we can add until we get the consistency we want. But today, I'm just going to add some water. I'm not going to be adding all the water I think it needs. I'm just going to add enough water for all the dry materials to dissolve. And then I'm going to let it soak overnight, because I found that all these particles and stuff, sometimes they need a little bit of time to absorb into the water, I think is the right word. So I'm going to add a little bit more, and I'm going to stir it up, and I'm going to use a blender to make sure that everything is completely blended into the water. Depending on the recipe, you may not want to use a blender if you have some elements that you want to keep, so to speak. But in this case, it's all going to be dissolved or sustained in the water. So let's add a little bit more water and then mix it up. Once all the materials have been covered in water, they won't make any dust anymore. So I think it's safe not to wear a mask at this point. Now the glaze have settled since yesterday. It's just been sitting there on my table. And we're now ready to add more water and blend it again and stir it around and make sure that it's totally smooth. And then we need to adjust it to the right consistency. So the ratio between water and dry materials need to be just right. I'm going to talk about how we can do that. As you can see, it has now settled some water on the surface, but also you can see it didn't settle the way that I just talked about with a hard button. It's just like, well, sort of muddy now, but it's easy to mix around. And that is due to the bentonite that we added. So it's always good to add that. And it's going to stay almost like that, even if you leave it for a few months. It's going to be this easy to mix up. Of course, it is way too thick now. It needs to be much thinner. So before we start actually measuring the thickness of the glaze, I can add more water with no problem. So definitely going to have more water. So I'm just going to add a little by the time, because as I mentioned before, I don't want to add too much water either, because it is much easier to add water than it is to remove it. So now that we have, I mean, it's getting closer, not close enough. Still need to add a little more. I will go again with the blender, just to make sure that it's all perfect. That looks good, although it's still too thick. Now it dumped part of the blender there. So just going to take that out. Still need a bit more water so I can rinse my hands into it. Before we make the final adjustment of the glaze, we need to sieve it, because you got to make sure that there are no lumps, no little pieces of dry material, because that's going to look awful when you glaze it. And to do that, we need these sieves. I buy mine from the pottery stores. I can't remember if it's from Carl Jaeger or BSZ or where exactly I got these, but you can buy them in all the stores that I mentioned. You can get different sizes. This one for smaller portions and smaller buckets is nice, but for these kind of buckets, or like these big ones, can contain a lot. And you can get them in different mesh size. So the size between the little holes. I think this is a 60 mesh. It usually works fine for most of my pottery. You can also get an 80 mesh. Some people swear to that for glazing glaze applications, but I think this one works well for me. And then of course you need a separate bucket. I'm just going to have it here. This is where the glaze is actually going to end. So the first one was actually just temporary. Now we're going to put this one over here and we're going to sieve it. And to get it through the sieve, I found that this brush, what is a dishwasher brush, is actually what works the best, because you then mix it around and it goes perfectly through. So let's do that. Whoa. Make sure that you get everything out, because down here is a lot of dry materials, of course, and we want all of that. So this one was actually mixed pretty well. Most of it just went through, but as you can see, there's something left here, and that's the drier part of it. And just by using this brush, it was a little bit difficult when I have to hold the camera too, but I think you get the point. You can actually push it through and make sure that everything that goes through into this bucket are no bigger than the mesh and the sieve. I think this is good enough. I usually just tap it a few times to make sure that there's not too much hiding underneath. So now we have a mat ready. So now we have a glaze that is free of lumps, and it's like a good consistency. It is, I think. I'm pretty sure it's still too thick. But now we have to adjust it. There are basically two ways, well, actually three ways, to measure the gravity or viscosity of your glaze. So the relation between dry materials and wet materials. And this is important because if it is very wet, very fluid, there's going to be less dry materials left on your pot when it dry. And if it's very heavy, if there's less water, it's going to leave a thicker layer of glaze. And depending on what glaze, it may have to be a little thicker or a little lighter. It depends. And that's why in the beginning, when I asked a question, rhetorical question, how much water to add, I said, I don't know. Because it depends. But let's talk about the different ways to measure the gravity or viscosity. I think one of the most common methods is with a hydrometer. This is this glass thingy that have some lead in there or something, heavy in the bottom, and you put it into a bucket, and it will sink deeper if there's more water, and it will stay higher if there's less water, and then you can read out the measurement. And typically a glaze would be somewhere between 30, 40, 50 or something. This is one way of doing it. It's just there's a few problems with this. First of all, they break very easy, and then you have glass all over and need to throw out the glaze, and yeah, it's just they're difficult to handle. But also they only measure viscosity. So if you have a glaze with a lot of gelling components, then it may show it as being more heavy than it really is, and having less water than it really does. And therefore you could potentially end up with a glaze that is not completely correct. However, having said that, there's like thousands of potters that rely on the hydrometer on a daily basis, and it works. I mean, they glaze, it works. So, I mean, even some people will claim, you can't do this, you can't use this, or it's not true. It works, and it's an easy way. But there's an even easier way, and a more precise way of doing it, and that is by measuring specific gravity. And that sounds very scientific and very difficult, but in reality, it isn't. You need two things, and that's it. You need a scale like this, a tube. I got this from a company that sells equipment for brewery, for home brewery. Very, very cheap. I think $1 each or something. I used to have some in glass. I broke them all, so now I bought some in plastic. Basically what you do is you put it on the scale. I have this scale that I use in my workshop. You put it on the scale, and then you reset it to 0. So 0 with the tube. And then you fill up water until it's 100 grams. And then you put a mark. I put a mark where 100 grams of water is. Now we have the scale, so to speak. So now when you want to measure specific gravity, you put in your glaze up to the same mark, exactly to the same mark. Then you read out how much it weighs. And if it weighs, let's say, 145 grams, then the specific gravity is 1.45. It is actually very easy. It's not very complicated or scientific. But it works, and it's very, very specific because that doesn't get influenced by the viscosity of the glaze. So it is, I think, probably the most accurate way of measuring the specific or the gravity of your glaze. I mentioned there's a third way. If you know your glaze really well, as I do with some of my glazes, you can do like I think most professional potters are doing. Just put down your finger, and then by looking at how the glaze runs off your finger, you can judge if it's too fat or it needs more water. This one definitely needs more water. I know by my experience, even though I don't know this particular glaze. If you want to go by specific gravity, and that's what we're going to do today, then the next question is, what should it be? Sometimes you can be lucky. In the book, the mid-range book by John Britt, he sometimes writes a suggested specific gravity. Very often he don't. And that can also be because it depends on application. Do you pour it? Do you dip it? Do you brush it? Is it on porcelain? Is it on stoneware? So I guess it can't always say. Sometimes you can search the forums, the forum that I recommend that supports this book, and people have some suggestions there. But if you can't find any, and I couldn't find anything for this glaze, it's typically somewhere between 135 in the low end, 145, 48 in the high end. I would probably start out aiming for something like 142, 43, something like that. In my experience, a glaze with these kind of ingredients would probably work well for the kind of clay that I'm working with. At least that's what I'm going to try. So before you measure, of course you need to reset your scale to 0 and always steer it so you get like a correct mix of the glaze, and then just take a little bit and pour it in. And I guess this one is way too thick, but we're gonna measure anyway. Actually, this is sort of surprising, but again, this is with a lot of feldspar. I haven't used it a long time, and it actually shows 138. The reason that this glaze feels so thick, even though it only have a specific gravity of 138, is because it's fluctuated. And now we are moving into more advanced part of glaze chemistry. But basically, a glaze can be fluctuated. It can also be defluctuated, which is the opposite. But in this case, the fluctuations appear because of the combination of a lot of zinc, and maybe also because I added the bentonite. Maybe I shouldn't have added that because of all the zinc. But I did, and now we are left with a glaze that is obviously too thick to apply. You can actually try and dip I have some test tiles like this, or you can just take whatever, some crap piece of ceramic that has been bisquified. Try and dip it into your glaze and see how it dries. It should dry quickly, and also it should dry in an even layer. It shouldn't run too much, and of course you shouldn't leave any lumpy parts. I'm sure if I try this with a test tile, it's not gonna apply the way that it should, because it is very thick. So let's try that first. I mean, now that I steered, I mean, it clearly feels too thick, and I'm pretty sure that's not gonna work. So if we dip a test tile in here, it does leave a very thick layer, and it runs a little bit, and also it looks like it dries too slowly. There's even a little bit of, maybe not, some pinholes, but this doesn't look right to me. If you have a glaze like this that feels too thick, but you check the specific gravity and it is within the range of what you want, then please don't add more water. Because if you just add more water, then it's gonna crackle off. It's not gonna settle well on your pot, basically. Instead, to deal with this fluctuation, you can add a component, either something called Darwin 7 or Darwin 811, or simply sodium silicate. I have sodium silicate. That's a very cheap component you can buy in most builders markets, and just add a few drops. It's very little it takes to change this. So let's try and see what happens when we do that. This is the sodium silicate. In Danish it's called waterglass, vandglas. Just add very little. I'm just gonna add what I can have in this cap. So very little, just a few grams. Then we're going to stir it and see how it changes. I don't think it's quite enough. I'll add a little bit more. Oh. I don't know if you can see it, but it feels almost like magic, because now it is so much more, it feels so much more thin, and it's not. It's still the same gravity, and that's why it's important to measure your glaze. Because now if I dip my finger in, and you see, now it runs off much better. This is closer to what I would usually expect a glaze to be. And now we could actually potentially leave it evaporate a little bit to raise the specific gravity, because now it is much more fluid. So let's see again if we dip a test tile in this, just a few seconds. I don't know if you can see it, but it doesn't run the same way, and it dries much quicker, and it doesn't appear to leave any cracks or anything. So I think I'm just gonna leave this to dry completely and see. Yeah, we can actually see it now. You see the difference? Yeah, I don't know if you can see it on the video. It's difficult. But this one definitely looks better. It's dry now. This one, it is dry now, but it's also a few minutes ago. But this looks much, much better. I think I will leave the lid off just for a few hours, maybe until the morning. It's not so warm now. It is winter, but it could evaporate a little bit. I mean, I can always add more water. That's easy enough. But I would like the gravity to get up maybe to 140. And so I will leave it like this until the morning. And then we will take it again before I have to use it for glazing. To increase the speed of evaporation, I have put the bucket in my bathroom where I have floor heating. It's not super warm, but it's just a little bit warmer here, so evaporation will go a little bit quicker. And I will check in a few hours to see if it feels good. And then I can put the lid on and remove it, of course, from the heated floor. Actually, one thing I want to do before I go down in glazes, I want to dip the last test tile in this. And now I have 3 test tiles, and I want to see how the difference play out. And now, of course, you may wonder how on earth, and I'm going to know which one is which when I fire them, or after I fire them. And here comes in this wonderful little tool. It's a underglaze pen. I'm not sure if you can actually see it here, but it is a pen and it's underglaze. So you can actually write with this and it's going to stay. So I'm going to write a number. This was the first, this was the second, this was the third. I'm going to write a number in the bottom of it, and that way we can know which one is which. First, I'm going to try with some mugs. And before I glaze them, always remember to wipe them off, because there is dust on the surface, or there could be finger marks or something. And if there is, the glaze won't stick. So always clean your pots before you glaze them. I also want to try it on a bowl. And you may wonder, why do you glaze nice pots with a glaze you don't know? You have the test tiles, so you should be glazing the test tiles first and see the result before you apply it onto a real pot. But you know, I'll probably make a video about this one day, but I really don't like test tiles too much. I use them for dipping to see how it actually attached to the clay. But the thing is, with test tiles, I don't know if you try to make test tiles, but so often when you make test tiles, they come out really good, and then you apply to a pot and it doesn't look so good. Or the other way around. Because the fact is, a pot with textures and whatever it is, it's just different than a test tile. So don't assume that it works just because it works on the test tile, or don't. So that's why I tried on my real pottery. Right ahead. Now I'm ready to do my first test glazing with this new charcoal matte black, which it isn't anymore because I altered it in so many different ways. But I hope it will be a good glaze. I'm going to do as I always do with my my mugs, that I glaze on the inside first. I don't know how long it should have. I usually give it like a few seconds. Then I pour it out. And then I let it dry before I glaze the inside. If there's a lot on the edges, I usually just, even though I'm going to glaze them on the outside too, I just don't want too thick of a layer there. So I'll just take it off. Now I'm ready to dip my mugs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on to the foot. I'm going to dip it. So I'm going to leave the last part unglazed. And I'm only going to do this because I know that this particular clay looks really good unglazed. If it's a more dull kind of buff clay, maybe you don't want to do that and you want to dip it all the way. In that case, I would have waxed the buttons. That's what I did with the bowl, because I'm going to dip that. But these ones I'm going to leave unglazed at the bottom. And I hope that's going to look good. So we'll try and see. Gonna rotate it a little bit and shake it just to make sure there's not too much dripping left. I always like to steer it a little bit in between, just to make sure that it didn't settle or some of the colorants sank down or something. Yeah. I mean, look how well that it applies. This is very good. A couple of weeks ago, maybe you remember, I did this video about how you can bake steel wool and get this wonderful steel powder out of it. And I tried to make some pots, and to some degree it succeeded, and to others not. One of the problems I found was that I sprinkled too much on. Where it's only very little, it was beautiful. So then I was thinking, how can I sprinkle less? And then I stumbled over this one. Do you know what this is? Like an old-fashioned thing for powdered sugar. And you can spread it on your cake. And I'm thinking, that should be perfect. Also because there's a sieve here, so I won't have any big lumps. So let's try and see what it does if I put it here. Of course, it runs right through, unless I hold it still. But look at this. I think this is going to be good. So I want to combine testing this tool with this new glaze. So I have this pot that is not so good. It's a little bit warped and stuff. So I want to try with that. I'm not going to take one of my favorite pots to do it. And this one, I'm going to dip using a tongue. So just going to steer it. And then I have to be sort of fast because I want to sprinkle this when it's still wet. So let me just prepare this. So now let's see how that turns out. That'll be fun to see. I wasn't actually planning on including this post-glaze fire part of the video, but now I glazed them and I fired them, so I just want to share with you the result of this new glaze. The plates, I didn't show you how I glaze them. Maybe I'll get back to that. I basically just hold them like this and I dip them in, out, and I wax them on the bottom so it was easy to remove the glaze. And I think they turned out Very beautiful. Sort of surprising that I thought they would be a little more bluish, grayish. I think the green part of it is due to the fact that the cobalt reacts with the titanium in the rutile. And now it's getting very geeky. I admit that, but that is how the glaze chemistry works. It is a wonder. All these chemicals react to each other. And so even though cobalt is blue, when you have the titanium, which is part of the rutile, it can react and get a little more greenish. But I do like it. And have this silky matte, not completely matte, not completely shiny, but it works great. I already ate a dinner on them and they work great. Also my experiment with this sugar powder machine for adding the baked steel wool worked out great. I did get a little bit too much there, but other than that, it kind of spreads really nice. It doesn't create like speckles, but it does create this sort of wood-fired feel to it that I really think is great. Also, the cups are wonderful. They look so nice. This is a high-grogged gray stoneware with some lava spots, and those lava spots kind of shine through the glaze, especially on the outside a little bit. But I mean, it looks great. It does have this sort of, not completely wood-fired feel to it, but sort of. The only thing that didn't turn out 100% okay, it's still interesting, is the one bowl where I sprinkled some oxides on. These are just kind of different. It's some zinc and red iron oxide and cobalt stain. But I mean, it's still interesting. I need to play around with this a little bit more. Also, for one of the cups that wasn't perfect, it had a little bit of a, well, not crack, but a little breakage in the rim. I tried to dip the top in my floating blue to see how that might turn out, to see how they mix together, and they mix beautiful. I do think, however, that it may be better to add the floating blue under the charcoal, but I do like how it flows into each other. It's definitely something I'll keep working with. So again, surprises, good results though, and just encourage you to play around with the glazes you make, change a little bit on the recipe, change the colorants, and combine them in different ways. This is actually all I got for you in this video, and I think I talked way too much. But I hope I somehow inspired you to go ahead and try and do your own glazes. It's really not that complicated. At least now you have all the knowledge you need. You know where to buy the glazes, you know where to get the recipes, or buy the ingredients, materials, you know where to find your recipes, and you know how to mix it. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, share, comment. If you do subscribe, you will get notified automatically when there's a new video coming up. As I said before, there should be one long-term video every Sunday. So I hope to see you soon again.